All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling Amanda Montell's The Age of Magical Overthinking. I gotta say, this book is seriously mind-blowing. Like, it exposes all these mental shortcuts our brains take, and, they end up making us overthink all the wrong things.
Yeah, it's wild how our brains try to simplify everything, but those shortcuts, sometimes they lead us down some pretty crazy paths, like to conclusions that are totally off base, sometimes even dangerous.
It's like our brains are playing tricks on us. Like,
Mm.
one of the things that really got me was this halo effect thing.
Oh yeah, the halo effect. It's kind of funny, actually. We see someone attractive or super successful, and bam, we just assume they're also like brilliant, kind, the whole package.
Totally. It's like, oh, they look good, so they must be good too. Like, haven't we all been starstruck by someone at some point? You just think they're amazing, even if you don't even know them?
All the time. And this whole halo effect thing, it gets even crazier with celebrities. Montell really dives into this, especially with Taylor Swift and her fans, the Swifties.
Oh, yeah, and those crazy fan scandals. Ticketgate, a Lavender Gate. It's like some fans put her on this, like, impossible pedestal. And then, when she doesn't live up to it, which, hello, who could, they totally lash out.
What's really interesting here is that Montell connects this whole thing to parasocial relationships, like those one-sided relationships we form with people in the media. It's almost like they can become kind of unhealthy. Fans demand this crazy level of devotion.
Like, if Taylor Swift doesn't answer your tweet, it's like a personal betrayal, right?
Exactly. And she also talks about Charlie XCX. Some of her fans, especially online, try to control her image and her music. It's a good reminder that fandom, even when it's positive, can have a dark side, especially when those relationships get, well, obsessive.
Makes you think, right? Like, how these biases pop up everywhere. Speaking of, let's talk about this sunk cost fallacy thing. This one really hit home for me.
Oh yeah, the sunk cost fallacy. It's that feeling of being totally stuck, like you've put so much time or money or even emotions into something, and you know it's not working, but you just can't walk away.
Montell actually shares her own story about staying in a toxic relationship for 7 years. Way too long, right? Because she felt like she couldn't just, like, throw away all that time. Have you ever felt like that?
Yeah.
Stuck in a job, a project, anything.
Happens all the time. And it's not even just about the stuff we put in, the actual resources. It's emotional, too. We don't want to admit we were wrong, that we wasted time.
We try to convince ourselves it was worth it, even when it so wasn't.
Totally. Montel has this great analogy. It's like you're hiking with a heavy backpack. You think you need everything in it, but it's weighing you down. Sometimes letting go, even if it feels bad, is the best thing.
And that whole decision to hang on, I feel like it's influenced by all this societal pressure. Think about the stigma around divorce, or
Yeah.
like how movies glorify those ride or die relationships.
Totally. All those stories make it harder to know when to just cut your losses. But honestly, sometimes starting fresh is the smartest move.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about this proportionality bias. It's like thinking that huge events have to have equally huge causes. Especially in today's world, this one really got me thinking.
Yeah, this bias is tricky. It plays on our desire for simple explanations. We want to make sense of things. Sometimes blaming a big event on a simple cause, it feels good, even if it's not the truth.
Right. Montell uses this really interesting case study. It's about this person called the manifestation doctor. They got super popular online, basically saying that any problem, mental or physical, was all because of quote unquote unresolved childhood trauma.
It's interesting how this taps into a need for control. If we think there's one single cause for our problems, it feels like we can fix them. But really, it's usually way more complicated than that.
And wanting simple answers, it can be dangerous too. Montell actually found out that the manifestation doctor was linked to, get this, far-right extremists and anti-vaccine groups. It's scary how, like, self-help stuff can be a gateway to something really harmful.
It is concerning, this proportionality bias, plus all the misinformation online. It makes people vulnerable to conspiracy theories. Like if something awful happens, there's got to be some evil mastermind behind it.
We're always looking for a bad guy, even when the truth is more complicated.
Exactly. Big events can have big causes, for sure, but sometimes it's a whole bunch of things, not just one easy answer.
Okay, this next one I think we've all experienced. The recency illusion. It's like thinking something you just noticed is brand new, when really it's probably been around forever.
Oh, yeah, the recency illusion. Our brains always prioritize what's new. It's like our recent experiences, they make us think things are suddenly everywhere.
It happens to me with slang all the time. I'll hear a word and think, oh, that's so new. But then I realize, wait, I probably heard that in high school. I just wasn't paying attention.
Montell uses the whole 2021 UFO thing as an example. Suddenly, it felt like aliens were about to land. Then, poof, the news moved on. But UFO sightings, they've been reported for decades, right? It's just our attention was on it, suddenly.
It's like outside, out of mind, but in reverse. The second we notice something, it feels like it's taking over the world.
What's interesting is how this connects to our sense of time, too. Like the pandemic, it messed with everyone's sense of time. It felt like it would never end. But looking back, it's a blur. And that makes this recency illusion even stronger. It feels like everything's changing so fast, out of control.
It's like a constant feeling of the world's gone crazy. But really, the world's always been a bit crazy, right? We just know more about it now. Information overload.
Yeah, and all that information makes it hard to know what's really new or important versus what's just grabbing our attention because it's shocking or different.
Okay, I think a lot of us can relate to this one. The overconfidence bias. It's that thing where we think we're way more capable and knowledgeable than we actually are.
It's kind of funny, right? Our brain's trying to protect our egos. It feels good to think we're competent, even when, well, maybe we're not.
Oh, I'm so guilty of this, especially with DIY projects. I always think I can handle way more than I can. Usually ends in disaster, let me tell you.
The research is fascinating, though. It shows that even super smart people overestimate their abilities. We all think we're better drivers, better cooks, better at making decisions than we really are.
Kind of humbling, right? Realizing how often we're overconfident.
It is. But there's a positive side, too. Montell argues that some overconfidence can be good, like for entrepreneurs or artists. You need to believe in yourself to take risks and go after big goals.
So it's like a little bit is good, but too much, and it backfires.
Exactly. Too much. And you end up making bad decisions and never learning from mistakes. And that brings us to a bias that's super relevant today with all this information overload. The illusory truth effect. Basically, if you hear something enough times, you start to believe it, even if it's not true.
Oh, this one is sneaky. It's like all those things we learned as kids that turned out to be totally made up.
Montell tells this funny story about the origin of bridal bouquets. Supposedly, it was to cover up the smell of unwashed brides in medieval times. Totally false, but people still believe it because they've heard it so much.
It shows how powerful repetition is. It shapes our beliefs about the world.
And think about misinformation, especially online. A catchy slogan or a meme, it goes viral, and suddenly millions believe it, even if it's not true.
It's like if we hear something enough, our brains just decide it must be true, even if there's no proof. Which brings us to another one that makes our beliefs stronger. Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, yeah. We look for info that confirms what we already think, and we avoid stuff that challenges it. It's like we build these little echo chambers around ourselves.
Montell tells this story about going to a dinosaur exhibit for comfort after Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's kind of funny, but it shows how we look for comfort in things we already believe, even if they're not related to the issue.
Just like, see, even the dinosaurs agree with me.
Exactly. But this confirmation bias, it's a big deal, right? It makes it hard to have real conversations, to bridge those divides between people who think differently.
Huge deal. We're all stuck in our own little worlds, not willing to listen to other viewpoints or admit that things are usually more complicated than we think.
It feels impossible to change someone's mind once they've decided what they believe.
You're right. It's a reminder that we got to be open to new info and, question what we think we know. It's crucial if we want to grow and understand each other.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Amanda Montell's The Age of Magical Overthinking. We've been digging into all these cognitive biases, the ones that shape how we see the world. Last time, we were talking about confirmation bias and how tough it is to change our minds.
It's funny, right, how we cling to our beliefs even when they're not doing us any good. Like, we want to be right, even if it makes us miserable. This book, though, it's making me think about all the other ways our brains might be messing with us. What else stood out to you?
Well, one that really struck me was this IKEA effect. It's this thing where we put more value on things we made ourselves, even if they're, not that great objectively.
Yeah.
Have you ever, done a DIY project that went a little sideways?
Oh, totally. I tried to build a bookshelf once from scratch. It ended up looking more like, I don't know, abstract art than furniture, but I was so proud of it, even though it's all wobbly and stuff. It's how our brains are wired, Montell thinks it's tied to our need to feel like we have control, like we can accomplish things. When we make something, even if it's not perfect, it gives us that feeling.
It's like, look what I made. Doesn't matter that it looks like a 5-year-old designed it.
Exactly. And in a world where everything feels so automated, impersonal, there's something really cool about doing stuff with your hands. Crafting, cooking, fixing stuff. It gives you that sense of accomplishment.
I totally agree. There's a real pride that comes with making something tangible, you know, even if it's not perfect. Okay, so moving on. What about this survivorship bias? What's that all about?
Survivorship bias, it's like this. We focus on the people who succeeded, the things that made it, and we ignore all the ones that didn't. It can make us draw some bad conclusions about what it takes to be successful.
So it's like you see all these successful entrepreneurs and you think, oh, I just got to do what they did. But you don't see all the people who tried the same thing and totally failed.
That's it. And we fall for this trap because, well, the survivors are the ones we see, right? Montell talks about social media influencers. We see their perfect lives, their vacations, the brand deals. It's easy to think, wow, they have it all figured out.
But what we don't see is all the people who are trying to do the same thing and not getting anywhere.
Right. It's like comparing your worst moments to everyone else's best moments. And the survivorship bias, it can be really bad when it comes to things like health and wellness. Montell talks about these young women who are documenting their illnesses online, really inspiring people. But a lot of times what's missing is, well, the fact that not everyone with those illnesses is going to have the same outcome.
So you see the people who survived and got healthy, and you think that everyone can do that. But that's not always true.
It is a dangerous oversimplification. It's important to remember everyone's different. What works for one person might not work for another. We got to see the whole picture.
Okay, so don't just focus on the winners, because everyone's journey is different. You know, we touched on this before, but I want to go deeper into the recency illusion. It's like our brains get fixated on what's new and shiny, and we think everything's changing so fast.
It's because we love novelty. Our brains are wired to pay attention to new, different things. It's like a survival instinct. But these days, we get so much information, so many updates all the time, that this recency illusion can make us feel super anxious and overwhelmed.
Like we're all having a collective future shock. Too much, too fast.
Yeah. And the news and media, they make it worse. The 24/7 news cycle, it's all about what's new and dramatic. It gives us this skewed picture of what's really happening.
You're constantly being told the world's ending, even though things have been much worse historically, right?
Right. It's all about perspective.
Mm.
So how do we manage this? Montell says we got to be careful about where we get our information. Pick quality over quantity.
It's like that saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Yeah.
We have to think critically.
Exactly. And sometimes, unplugging can be good. Stepping away from all the information, spending time in nature, doing things that make you happy. It helps you reset, You get some perspective.
Hit the reset button on your brain. Okay, so this next one, I think we've all experienced this. The fundamental attribution error. It's about how we judge other people.
Oh, yeah, the fundamental attribution error. Basically, we blame someone's personality when they do something instead of thinking about the situation they're in.
Like someone cuts you off in traffic, you think, what a jerk. But maybe they're having a bad day or rushing to the hospital. We don't consider that.
That's it. And this bias, it causes a lot of problems, misunderstandings, arguments, especially when we're too quick to judge without thinking about the whole situation.
And it's got to be even worse online, right? You don't really know the person you're interacting with.
Oh, absolutely. We judge people based on one comment, one post. We don't think about their background, what they meant, Maybe they just didn't say it right.
We assume the worst instead of giving them the benefit of the doubt. So how do we stop doing this?
Montell says empathy is key. Try to understand their point of view. Think about what might be going on in their life that's making them act that way.
Walk a mile in their shoes.
Exactly. And be more curious, less sure of yourself. Ask questions. Try to clarify things. You might be wrong about what you think they meant.
That's a good point. Okay, this next bias really hit me. The rosy retrospection bias. It's that thing where we remember the past as being better than it actually was.
It's like our brains are trying to rewrite history, Make our lives seem more pleasant.
Oh, I do this all the time. Thinking back to certain times in my life, like they were perfect.
Yeah.
But forgetting all the bad stuff that was happening.
It's normal. We all do it. And sometimes it's good, It helps us cope with bad memories and be optimistic about the future.
Like a defense mechanism?
Exactly. But the problem is it distorts reality. If we're always looking back with rose-colored glasses, we don't learn from our mistakes. We might not see that things need to change.
It's like, if you're always looking back, you might miss what's right in front of you.
Right. It's about balance, appreciating the past, but not letting it cloud your judgment. Okay, this next one sounds like it could really mess with your decision making. The anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias, what's that?
It's when we get stuck on the first piece of information we hear, even if it's totally wrong or irrelevant.
So, like, if you're negotiating something and someone starts with a ridiculously low offer, you might suck on that number, even though you know you deserve more.
Exactly. And this anchoring bias, it affects all kinds of decisions, buying stuff, evaluating people, forming opinions. That first impression, even if it's wrong, it sticks with us.
It's like our brains latch onto that first piece of info, and they use it as a guide, even when it shouldn't be.
That's right. And the scary part is we don't even realize it's happening a lot of the time. So how do we beat this?
Yeah, how do we avoid that trap?
One thing is try to wait before making a decision, if you can. Get more information, think about it from different angles, and try to look for arguments against what you believe, especially if you feel really strongly about it.
It's like sleep on it. Right. Give your brain a break, and you might make a better decision.
Right. And this next one might sound weird, but it can be both good and bad. The optimism bias.
Okay, how can being optimistic be bad?
Well, the optimism bias is when we think good things are more likely to happen than bad things. Like when you're young, you feel invincible, like nothing bad can ever happen to you.
And while that kind of optimism can be really motivating, it can also make you take risks, not plan well, and not be ready when things go wrong.
Exactly. It's like hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
So how do we balance that out? How do we stay positive without being naive?
Montell says you have to be realistic, See that both good and bad things can happen. Don't get too pessimistic, but don't be naive either.
Keep your head in the clouds, but your feet on the ground.
Exactly. And that brings us to another bias that can really affect how you feel. The negativity bias.
Yeah.
This one's all about how we focus on the bad stuff more than the good stuff.
Oh, I know this one. It's like when you get a review at work, and it's mostly good, but you just can't stop thinking about that one negative comment.
Perfect example. Montell says this negativity bias comes from, like, way back in our evolution. We had to be aware of danger to survive. But now it just makes us anxious and pessimistic. It gives us a skewed view of reality.
It's like our brains are wired to focus on the negative, even when there's so much positive stuff, too. How do we get over this negativity bias, then?
Montell suggests a few things. Practicing gratitude, challenging those negative thoughts, and taking care of yourself.
So we have to train our brains to focus on the good stuff, even though it's harder.
That's it. Build those mental muscles to change your perspective and see the good things.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see all the ways my brain tricks me. But what's the main takeaway you'd give our listeners?
I think the most important thing is to remember these biases are normal. Everyone has them. They're not good or bad in themselves.
Right. It's not about getting rid of them, which is probably impossible anyway. It's about recognizing them and learning how to deal with them.
Exactly. Become more aware of your own thinking. Question what you believe. Look for different points of view. Be open to learning, to growing, to changing your mind.
That's pretty powerful, actually. And if you want to really dive into all this, I recommend Amanda Montell's book, The Age of Magical Overthinking. It's funny, insightful, and really relatable.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been spending time with Amanda Montell's The Age of Magical Overthinking, unpacking all those sneaky cognitive biases, the ones that shape our perceptions and decisions. We've already talked about so many, from the halo effect to negativity bias.
It's crazy how many of these mental shortcuts we're taking without even realizing it, right? And how they can lead to, well, some pretty unexpected outcomes. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Totally. This book, though, it doesn't just point out those biases, it also helps us understand how to manage them, maybe even use them to our advantage.
Yeah, and one of the most important things Montell talks about is awareness. Just knowing that these biases exist, that they affect how we think, that's a huge first step to making better decisions.
It's like once you see the trap, you're less likely to fall into it.
Yeah.
But how do we actually deal with these biases in everyday life? What are some practical tips?
One big one is to really build up your critical thinking skills. Question what you assume, look for different perspectives, and don't just believe everything you hear. Especially these days, with so much information coming at us from all sides, you got to be able to filter it, figure out what's real and what's not.
So it's not just about what you think, it's about how you think.
Exactly. And you have to be careful about what you let into your head. It's easy to get caught up in the news or spend hours on social media, but that can create a really distorted view of the world.
It's like you need a mental diet.
Yeah.
Choose information that's good for you, not just whatever's loudest.
I like that. A mental diet. And sometimes, believe it or not, the best thing you can do is take a break from all the information. Unplug, get out in nature, do something you enjoy. It helps you reset, get some perspective.
Get the reset button on your brain. So instead of letting those biases control us, we can actually learn to think better, be more open-minded, and notice those mental shortcuts. That's pretty cool, right?
It is. And it all starts with being curious and humble. Be open to learning new things, admit when you're wrong, and be willing to change your mind. The world's a complicated place, and there's always more to learn.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. I'm realizing how much I just assumed my own thinking was always right and how these biases can really mess things up.
And that's what's so great about this book. It makes you think about your own thinking. It makes you question the assumptions you have about yourself and about everything else.
So the big question is, what do we do with all this new awareness now that we know about these biases?
Well, first, just accept that they're there. We all have them. It's not about blaming yourself. It's about understanding how they work and how they affect you.
Like once you see them, you can start making better choices.
Exactly. And try to have a growth mindset, be open to learning, challenge what you believe, and realize that you're always growing and changing how you see things.
It's tough though, right? Admitting you don't know everything.
It is, but it's important. And it helps to be around people who challenge you, who think differently. That diversity of thought, it helps you break out of those echo chambers where your biases just get stronger.
It's like if everyone's always agreeing with you, you're probably missing something.
For sure.
Hmm.
And lastly, be kind to yourself. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, to feel like you're always messing up. But we're all human, we're all learning as we go.
Give yourself a break, learn from your mistakes, and keep growing. And that's a wrap for today's deep dive into Amanda Montell's The Age of Magical Overthinking. Hopefully you've learned some cool stuff about how your brain works and all those sneaky biases that are shaping your thinking. Thanks for joining us, and happy thinking!